Hi everyone, this is Rosie and welcome to my studio where we can explore creativity together. Okay, it's time for us to get started sewing our American Girl doll dress together that we cut out on the Cricut Maker. So I have my pieces laid out here. The first three pieces are for the dress front. The next three pieces are for the dress back. And then number 7 over here, that's for the interfacing on the back of the dress. And then the pieces over here are for the bodice. I've printed out the instructions, so let's just look at a couple of things briefly. We always sew with right sides of fabric together, unless the pattern tells you otherwise. They do give you a fabric key so that when you're following the instructions, you can visually see what they're talking about. This is what the right side of the fabric would look like in the instructions, the wrong side, the interfacing, and the lining. Then they just show you what the notches and other markings look like. Those are all for alignment. In this pattern, everything will be 1/4 of an inch seam allowance unless they tell you otherwise. Then they show you how to clip the curves. They show you what they mean when they tell you to make a hem, what a narrow hem would look like, what gathering would look like, and how to trim the corners of your pieces. So now that we've looked at that very quickly, let's just get started sewing. So the first step is to sew pieces 1, 2, and 3 together. So piece number 1, that's going to be the center seam of the front. And then we'll sew piece number 2 to piece number 1, and then piece number 3 to piece number 2. And there are actually 2 sections. So we'll do a left side and a right side. And then we'll sew the 2 sections down the middle. When you're sewing your panels together, you have to make sure that you line everything up correctly. And the notches are what tell you that you have it lined up correctly. So the center seam right here is on piece 1, and you can see there's a double notch right there. So when we sew number 2 to number 1, we're not going to sew on the side where the double notch is. We're going to sew on the side where the single notch is. And then if you notice on piece 3, there are 2 notches, one here and one here. So you want to sew the single notch on piece 2, line it up with the single notch on piece 1, and that is your seam right there. And make sure that you have right sides together and that you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam. So let's go ahead and do that on the sewing machine. Okay, I have my pieces pinned together. I have the single notch lined up on piece 1 and piece 2. I've pinned everything together. Now if anybody's curious, I'm using a Juki DX7. I have a 1/4 inch piecing foot in my machine, so that's going to give me my 1/4 inch seams, and I'm on a stitch length of 2.0. So I'm going to take a few stitches forward, a few stitches backward, and then I start sewing. Never sew over pins. Then when you come to the end, you'll take a few stitches backwards to lock in your seam. Now I sewed this from the bottom up, and it's generally a good idea to always sew in the same direction, so when I put on my next piece I will be sewing from the bottom up. Okay, I've pinned piece 2 to piece 3. Both piece 2 and piece 3 have 2 single notches on them, so I lined those up right here, and that's how you know that you have the right pieces together. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this again from the bottom up. So now we have all 3 panels on one side of the dress front sewn together. Now you need to go and repeat this process with the remaining 3 panels for the front. So go ahead and do that, and then when we come back we'll sew up the front seam. Now that I have the 2 front sections sewn together, we're going to sew the middle front seam. So we will put the right sides of the fabric together, matching up the double notch right here, and then we will pin it and sew it down. Okay, I have the left and right pieces pinned together down the center with the double notch there, and now I'm just going to sew it at the same 1/4 inch seam. And now that I have the left and right sewn together down the middle, what I need to do is press my seams open. So what they want you to do is the center seam would be pressed open. This other seams, the ones to the sides, will be pressed towards the center. So go ahead and do that. Okay, now that we're done with the front, we're going to get started on the back pieces. So just like the front, the back has two sections, and there's a left and a right, and they're made up of pieces 4, 5, and 6. Unlike the front, the center seam in the back is not sewn together. This will be left open for your closure. So if you decide to use buttons or Velcro, whatever, this will be left open. Now we're going to sew these together, and again you want to match everything up according to the notches. The notches is what tells you that you have your pieces in the right place. I have piece 4 and 5 pinned together, and now I'm going to sew it from the bottom up, still using a 1/4 inch seam. Now I've pinned together pieces 5 and 6. I'm going to sew that, and when you're done sewing these 3 pieces together, go and do the other side. So you'll be doing the same thing all over again. Now I have both of my back pieces, the left and the right, sewn together, and I have ironed all my seams towards the center back. So now it's time to sew together the front and back pieces at the side seams. To join the front to the back, you just simply place the side seams together, matching up the notch. There's just one notch there. And you do the same on both sides. Okay, so the last step for the back of the dress is to pin piece number 7, which is the facing. That will be where the buttons go, to the back of the dress. So you'll sew 1/4 inch seam here, but then a 1/2 inch across the bottom, and then you're going to take out a 1/4 inch section at the very bottom of the dress. Now I have piece number 7, which is the facing, pinned to the back of the dress, and I'm going to sew, just remember, you're going to sew 1/4 inch down this way, but when you get to the bottom, you'll be sewing a 1/2 inch across the bottom. Okay, so we have the facing sewn onto this side. Now just do the same thing for the other side. And now that I have the facing sewn down on both sides, I'm just going to trim this up the way it tells me to in the instructions. And you'll do this on both sides. Okay, so there you go. After you've trimmed down your facing here, you want to turn it like this, and you can get something like, if you have a point turner or a little wooden skewer or something, you want to just very gently nudge that corner out until you get a nice sharp corner. And then the next thing that you do is you want to turn up your hemline. So if you use the blue marker on the Cricut, you will have a line there. I know it's hard for you to see because of my color fabric here, but I can see it. It's a 1/2 inch, so from the bottom to the line, it's a 1/2 inch. So you want to start turning your hem up a 1/2 inch all the way around. So you just get yourself a ruler and measure off a 1/2 inch, and then just put a little pin in there. Do that all along the bottom. And then after you have everything measured and pinned down, you'll take this over to your ironing board and just press this in place. And then after you've pressed this in place, you will just run a straight stitch all along the bottom for your hem. Now, if this were a real dress for a little girl or for whoever, I would actually not leave a raw edge like that. But since this is just a doll dress, I'm just going to leave it with the raw edge turned up like that. So after I turn the interfacing with the wrong sides together now, so the wrong side of the interfacing is matching the wrong side of the inside of the dress, I just stitched right along here to tack that down, and then I stitched all the way across the hem. And then I went to the other side and I stitched up the facing on the other side. So that's what it looks like now. So now we're ready to get started on the bodice. So we're going to be using pieces 10. There's 1 of 10, and piece 11. There's 2 of 11. Number 11 is the little ruffle that goes on the front of the bodice. So the first thing that we need to do is make a narrow hem along the straight edge on both pieces. And according to the directions, a narrow hem is 1/4 of an inch. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn these edges under 1/4 of an inch. We'll press them and then we will stitch down. So let's go do that, and then I'll be back with the next step. I just finished my narrow hem on both of the pieces that are marked number 11. And now I'm going to run a basting stitch along this edge where the curve is, so that we can make the gather that we need to create here. So in order to do that, I'm going to set my stitch length to 4, and I'm pulling out 2 long threads here. So I have my top thread and my bobbin thread, and I want to have these long tails out here when I sew the basting stitch. So I'm going to put down the presser foot. And now I'm actually also going to move my needle position over to the right side here, because right now it's in the center. That would be too far in. I want it to be more like maybe at 1/4 of an inch. So let me move that over. Okay, so I have my needle moved all the way over to the right side, and I'm at a stitch length of 4.0. And so sometimes when you're sewing on something really small like this, if you have the zigzag plate on, the fabric could get sucked down into the feed dog area. So I have these long threads here because I need them for my basting stitch, but sometimes if you have a situation like I just described, if you have these long threads here and then you hold them, it'll prevent everything from getting sucked into the machine. And then once you're going, you can let go of the threads. Go slowly around the curve. It's a very tight curve because it's such a small piece. Okay, you're going to take it out. And leave yourself a nice long tail. Okay. Now, to gather this up, what I like to do is put a pin somewhere in the top at one end, and then I can take my threads here and you wrap them around the pin that you just put in, kind of like in a figure 8 shape, and that will hold those threads steady when you're trying to pull to make your gathers. And then on this end here, you're going to take either the top thread or your bobbin thread, it doesn't really matter which one, and you'll just start pulling very gently to gather everything up. And you move the gathers all the way up to the top, and you keep going until you have the piece at just the right size. When you're creating the gathers on piece 11 to create the ruffle, this piece number 11, once it's gathered up, needs to fit on piece 10 between the top and the dot on the bottom. You do not want the ruffle to go all the way to the bottom. You need this little 1/4 of an inch allowance down here at the bottom. So just fit the ruffle between the top of piece 10 and the blue dot that's on there. Now the other thing that I had said is when you pull your gathering threads, you can either pull the top or the bottom. It doesn't matter which one you choose, and that's correct. But whichever one you choose, you have to stick with that one. So in other words, you can't start pulling the top thread and then later go pull the bottom thread, because what will happen is you'll lock those stitches and you won't be able to gather anymore. So whichever one you choose, stick with that particular thread, either the top or the bottom. So here's the piece now, all completed with the ruffles on each side of that little placket, and you can see here that it goes from the top of piece number 10 down to the blue dot, and I pressed everything nice and neatly, and then this little piece here, they want you to fold that under, so I pressed it under. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Now the next step is to take bodice piece number 8, and they want us to put the ruffle piece that we just made onto the bodice. And you'll center it by matching the large dots on the ruffled piece and on the bodice. And here's my ruffled piece, and I'm just going to match up the dots and baste it on. Now they only want you to do a basting stitch around the neckline. They don't want any of this other sewn down here. So this will be free. It'll just be basted at the top. So I'll go do that now, and then I'll be back. Okay, so here it is. I basted it just on the neck edge, and you can see the basting stitch easier if you look from this side. And then after we do that, oh, and remember, this is not sewn down yet. It's just basted along the top. Then the next step would be to take the 2 back pieces, so 2 of the pieces that are marked number 9, and you're going to line up the shoulder seams, and you'll match the notches on the front and the back, and we're just going to sew across each shoulder seam at 1/4 of an inch. So I'll go do that now. So now the front bodice is sewn to each side of the back bodice with a 1/4 inch seam at the shoulder. Now you still have 1 more bodice front and 2 more bodice backs. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to take that and sew those at the shoulders, and then after that I'm going to show you how to put the 2 pieces together. So now you should have 2 bodices. The first one here has the ruffle on it. That's the outside of the dress. And then the second one does not have a ruffle. This is your facing, or the lining of the bodice. So what they want you to do now is, first of all, you need to iron open your shoulder seams on both pieces, this one and this one. What they also want you to do is they want you to turn under the bottom of the facings 1/4 of an inch. So you're going to measure that, turn it under, and press it down, and then you'll also do that on the back of the facings. And make sure that you turn it into the wrong side of the facing. So let's go do that, and then we'll sew the 2 bodice pieces together. So here's the front of the bodice. Everything has all been nicely pressed, and I have here the lining, or the facing, and again it's all pressed, and I've turned the bottom edge of the front bodice under 1/4 of an inch, and the bottom edge of the back bodices under 1/4 of an inch. What they want us to do now is line everything up here, pin it together, so you're going to match your notches, your dots, and then if you look at your instructions, it tells you where to sew. So if you look at your instructions now, it tells you where the sew lines are, and the sew lines are still 1/4 of an inch. So you're going to sew up the back side, around the neck, down the other back side, and then you're going to sew the armholes on this side and the armholes on that side. Make sure that you match up your seams for your shoulders, match up your notches, and match up your dots when you pin everything together. So I'm going to go sew that. And then after I'm done, I'm going to clip around all the curves. So they want you to clip around this curve, around the curves in the armholes. And then after you do that, we'll press everything open, and then I'll show you how to turn it. So I finished sewing along this edge here, and I've sewn the armholes. And on this side, I press the seams open just to make it a little bit easier when I turn it. And to turn this now, what we're going to do is open this up and reach inside here, and we will just work this through. Takes a little bit of doing. When you're working on something this tiny, it's definitely a little bit more challenging. So just keep working at it until you finish pulling it through all the way. You'll do the same thing on the other side. You have to just keep pushing through. Okay. And once you have it turned, you'll take your little point turner or skewer, whatever you have, and you're going to gently, very gently, because you don't want to go through any seams, turn your points out again. And then once you have everything all nice and flat as it should be, you'll go back to your iron and just work on ironing these seams so that they're nice and flat. So I'm going to go do that now, and then I'll show you how to close up the side seams. Okay, so here's the bodice. It's turned right side out and everything's been ironed, and now what we need to do is sew up the side seams. So to do that, you're going to take the piece and open it up this way, and then take the back of the bodice. You're going to open that up, and then you're going to put them together. You're going to match seams and notches, and then you're going to sew across here 1/4 of an inch. So go ahead and do that on both sides. So I just finished sewing the side seams, and then you'll just turn the sides down and press that on both sides. And then when you're done doing that, we're going to pin the bodice to the skirt of the dress. So this is exciting because we're getting very close to the end now. So just press that nicely, and then we can pin this to the skirt. Now, when you're sewing the bodice to the skirt, make sure that you don't catch this. This has to be up. This will be sewn down last. So make sure that that is not in the way. And the other thing is, you want to make sure that the seam that you turned up 1/4 of an inch, you don't want to sew that either. I have the bodice now pinned to the skirt. So match up your edges, match up your notches. Wherever there's a seam, make sure it matches up with the seam on the skirt. And make sure, this is important, make sure that the side that has the ruffle is the side that's getting pinned to the skirt here. So you're going to go ahead and sew 1/4 of an inch seam, and again, you also want to make sure that this edge here that we had folded and pressed down 1/4 of an inch, make sure that that does not get caught in any seams. That needs to stay free. The bodice is now sewn onto the skirt, and I'm going to go do some pressing here, but before you do your pressing, what you'll want to do is this seam that we turned under 1/4 inch, you're going to want to place that over your seam there to hide that seam, and then you'll just stitch. You'll just do a little hand stitch. If you want, you could stitch it on the machine too. It doesn't really matter. If it was a little girl's dress again, I would probably hand stitch it down, but since it's a doll's dress, I might just stitch it across on the machine. So we're going to press that, and then after everything is all pressed and nice and neat, the last thing to do on the front would be to put this piece down here, and remember we turned this under 1/4 inch, and then you're just going to stitch right along here on the edges. And after that, the only thing that you have left is the buttonholes. I'm not going to show you how to do any buttonholes because every machine does them differently. So, and actually on this dress I wouldn't even put buttonholes on it. I would probably just do some Velcro closures on it. So, but that's your choice. You can do whatever you like. If you prefer the buttonholes, you can do them on your machine, or you can stitch on some Velcro and close it up that way. So let me go do this, and then I'll finish stitching this down here, and then I'll show you what it looks like all nice and ironed and pressed. Okay, so she's basically done except for the back closure. I just stitched this down right along the inner edge here, and it will be stitched over the bodice and a little bit over the skirt. So there it is, all finished. You can remove your blue markings just by soaking in a little bit of cold water. So I hope that you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed making it for you. Please like and subscribe.